So welcome back. In this session, we're going to discuss the analysis of the historical load data. Now, this is pretty much an automated step. The only thing you have to remember before you kind of analyze the load data is going to say, here's load the model inputs, clean the data, and then analyze the load data. I'm not actually going to hit that button and run it because really the key thing here is how do you interpret the results that you get and understand what are the load patterns that you're seeing and really what are the implications in terms of planning. So we're going to essentially go directly to the results, which are all loaded into the historical load analysis portion when you hit that update button. And we're going to walk through a series of tables and charts that come out when we take a look at this. So the first one that jumps out is really just a simple summary statistics by year. And it's pretty simple. There's a couple things that I would look at here. One is it tells you here's how many observations were included in the analysis. It is not exactly 8760 because some of those observations got removed in the data cleaning process. But it's relatively complete, but if the numbers dip, so you don't have a full annual data set, I would pay attention to this more carefully. We also have information about here's the range of results that we see from minimum to maximum, and really what's the amount of load values that exceed 1% of the time, 5% of the time, 25% of the time. And we have it by year, so it kind of says here's a season, whether we want to look at the full year, summer, winter, or shoulder, and then we have it for each individual year. And this is all historical, so realistically, the weather had an influence in terms of what happened that year, probably the most influence, and in addition to that, you may have had some load growth happening absent weather over the time frame, or load decreases happening over the time frame. But it's essentially to ground us. So probably the key thing you want to pay attention is that maximum value, because and likely something like the 95th percentile, because they in essence are looking at how often what is your peak and how close are you to the design range or above it. But also in 95th percentile, you can say, well, 5% of the hours are above that value. So the 95th percentile here is below the design rating. This is a fake design rating for RDRJ, which is the example that we're using in this case, just simply because when we get to the forecasting and the valuation, we want to see some results. But it's useful, and you can see right here that your peak, it was in 2011 over this 4-year analysis period, and you also got pretty close to it in the 2013. Almost all of the peaks were reached in the summer. It's not a winter peaking utility, but it gives you concrete numbers that you can identify. The next chart that we see here is a chart that looks at the historical multi-year load duration curves. And there's two sets of them. One of them has it in terms of MVA and hours, and the other one has it in relative components based on the loading factor, or really the MVA divided by the summer rating, and with the x-axis being the percent of hours overall. And in both cases, we kind of show the top 500 hours as well as the full year or the full time frame. This is a 5-year time frame, so it's actually 40-some odd thousand observations. So that's the concept behind it. As a quick reminder, a load duration curve is simply ranking the hours from the highest load to the lowest load in order, right? So this is the peak overall, the second highest day, etc. And it becomes very relevant because a lot of the criteria for upgrades are really tied to not exceeding the long-term emergency rating for too many hours. You can exceed it for some hours because it really has more to do with, you have to have a contingency in tandem for it to matter. But if you're exceeding it too many hours, you're exposing yourself to too much risk. So we're really looking at load duration curves as being the key trigger for the results, and in particular, whether or not that load duration curve amount is above a certain threshold for a prolonged period of time. So these are pretty self-intuitive and useful overall, but they tell you a lot about the peak. We do the same thing again, but rather than doing it over the full period, the 5-year period, that has the year-to-year variation in weather, you kind of look at individual years. And there's two things that jump out from the individual year results. One is it is going to highlight if there is variation from year to year weather. So you may have a much hotter or more extreme year and cooler years. So this example, we see 2014 right here is a cool year, as was 2010. Now, when we see breaks like this, oftentimes I ask myself, is that because of weather? And because it's two completely different years, I'll lean towards saying yes. But sometimes those breaks can represent, disruptive changes in a particular location. So to give you an example, in a specific project we analyzed, we had a break like this. And it turned out that at that location, some of the large customers had installed a massive amount of solar. So it literally changed the load duration curve from one year to the next. Now, again, this is the top 100 hours by year, which is analogous to top 500 hours over 5 years. And here is the full year where we see the full 8760. And like us, we kind of have the normalized approach as we did above, where we focus on really the top 1% of the hours, which is really the 88 top hours or top 100 hours here. And you can see the really peak of the load duration curve, and then we essentially do the same thing for the full year. So that's useful, in terms of interpreting this, but it doesn't really tell us much in terms of whether it was the weather that was causing the differences or something else. But it's useful feedback regarding the historical load patterns. The next chart is instructive in terms of when those peaks are happening. There are a few instances where you will have winter peaking locations. Some that are dual peaking, they're relatively rare nowadays. But what we have done here is took the analysis period, in this case 5 years that we input in the data set, and essentially identified the top 10 load days over the time frame where we had clean data, and essentially plotted. So we can see here's what the load patterns are for those days. And there's a handful of days missing because a couple of those days were identified, as days for exclusion overall. So you can see a couple minor gaps there. And but we can see very quickly what the hours of the peak are and the magnitude of it and what month it happened. So very quickly, I see most of these days happen in July. And this is over a 4-year period. And we see that the peaks are primarily in 11, 13, and 12. So there's the cool years didn't even hit the top 10. And we also see that, at least for one of those days, it seems to be pretty extreme. But it appears that a storm hit, which is typically where you see a dip like this. It's a storm to hit on a very hot day. And you see another one down here, which is even more extreme, clearly a storm that came in. The other aspect is that you can start looking at this and start extracting information about, well, if you were literally trying to shave the load, what hours would you need to cover? And what becomes quite apparent is that the variation in the weather has an effect in terms of how much load you have to shave and how many hours you have to shave overall. Obviously, this day, the 9th highest load day, you could shave less than in the more extreme day and for fewer hours. Next graph is same concept, but really just zooms in and shows this as a percentage of the summer rating, or what we refer to as the loading factor, so we can actually see it in relationship to the ratings rather than just in terms of MVA. The fifth set of information that we provide is information about weather sensitivity. Now, if you have been doing the data cleaning, you will have seen lots of information about weather sensitivity. So the distinction here is that each of these colors represents a different year. And it can tell us a few different things. Like, for example, we see a lot more blue here, 2014, than we do anything else. That was a pretty cold year. And if we go to the upper extreme, we see more of the squares and the triangles, and maybe a couple of these other ones. So that's 2013 and 2011, and a little bit 2012, which happened to be those top 10 peak days overall. And if we dive even deeper into this, when we have a clear difference in the load patterns, we will sometimes see that the earlier years are lower than the later years, and that's when we have pretty aggressive growth. In some cases, we get to see that pretty clearly. Again, just information about the historical patterns, less about the process. This is simply the time trend. This you've seen before. This is with the clean data, but you will see it in the data cleaning process. But again, it's just a quick summary, just to remind people in terms of the time trend. And in some cases, you can see clear jumps. In this case, RDRJ, we had to inquire about this because the load seems a little bit higher in these years than in these years, and it was not a load transfer, so legitimate growth. Next, we kind of show a plot that looks at peaking risk allocation. And peaking risk allocation essentially is helping you identify here's the hours when you're most likely to experience high loads. And it really boils down to taking a load duration curve, which you saw above, the tip that, and shaving it. And essentially saying when would I have needed those megawatt hours to shave that load. And in this instance, we obviously have a bigger need in hours 15, 16, and 17, but the need actually spans a number of additional hours, but you just need less of it. And there's a slight risk on the weekend. It's probably small enough that you can ignore, but it is something that in some cases you actually want to pay a notice to differences between weekdays and weekends. And in a handful of places, you want to actually look at different seasons. Not too common, but that can happen. The last chart that we include in the historical analysis is probably the most critical one. And it is looking at the year-by-year growth after we have accounted for weather differences across the year, after we have accounted for differences in solar penetration across the year, after we have accounted for differences in energy efficiency activity across years, and other components. And what it pulls out, it fixes in this chart, conceptual, we basically fixed everything. So the final year is 100%, right on the dot. And that's basically your starting point for your forecasting, is 100% of the last year of the data that you included. But we isolated and said, well, what was the load after factoring out weather differences and all these other factors relative to the most current load? In this case, we see a pattern that shows a load increase. We see variability around that trend line, but this is the trend line that we're going to carry out in the forecasting. And this is the variability that we'll carry forward in the forecast. Now, a couple things to watch out for. When I look at a trend like this, I'm always wary if there's something that is really, really influential in terms of the value. So whenever I see a value that is really extreme, whether it's in this side or in the opposite side, I want to go back and take a look at my data cleaning just to ensure that it's not a data cleaning issue, that really is a change in loads. The other factor that jumps out for me when I look at this, I always look at the amount of variability around the trend line, because if there's a lot of variability in the trend line, either typically happens with smaller locations where changes in load are more disruptive, but the variability is going to have a big influence in the load in the forecast, because the more variability we have in growth, the less we know what growth will be like 5-10 years from now. So this sums it up. It's basically a whole bunch of feedback in terms of what the historical loads look like, and it's mainly to help you get some insight in terms of the patterns that we're seeing at that location, and less about the overall forecast. So next we'll cover the actual forecast component and detail that and cover that in some detail.